Mama, why are you crying again? 7-year-old Kayla stood in the doorway of the small bathroom, her pink pajamas wrinkled from sleep, her eyes wide with worrying as she watched her mother grip the edges of the sink like it was the only thing keeping her standing. Denise Williams quickly wiped her face with the back of her hand and forced a smile that felt like broken glass against her cheeks. The kind of smile that mothers learn to wear when their hearts are shattering but their children need to believe the world is still safe. She knelt down and pulled her daughter into her arms, breathing in the sweet scent of her strawberry shampoo, holding onto this small piece of heaven while her entire world burned down around her. 3 days ago, Denise had been a respected waitress at the Heritage, one of Charleston's most beloved restaurants, a place where history lived in every brick and every table told a story that stretched back 60 years. Now she was the most hated woman on the internet, her face plastered across social media with words underneath that made her stomach turn. Words that called her racist things she couldn't even repeat. Words that said she had deliberately humiliated to wealthy white customers because of the color of their skin. The review that started it all had been shared over 200,000 times. And with each share, another piece of Denise's reputation crumbled into dust. Another door closed in her face. Another friend stopped returning her calls. The nightmare had begun. On a rainy Tuesday evening, when Richard and Melissa Thornton walked through the front door of the Heritage with their designer clothes, and their diamond watches and their noses tilted toward the ceiling like they were smelling something unpleasant. Denise had been working at the restaurant for 8 years, ever since she was 26 years old and desperate for a job that would let her support her baby girl after Kayla's father disappeared like morning fog. She loved the Heritage not just because it paid her bills, but because it felt like family, because the owner, Mr. James, had given her a chance when no one else would, because the regular customers knew her name and asked about her daughter and left her tips that helped pay for Kayla's dance lessons. The restaurant was special in ways that most people never understood. Built in 1962 by a black man named Harold Jefferson who had dreamed of creating a place where everyone could eat together during a time when such dreams could get you killed, the Thorntons had arrived without a reservation on one of the busiest nights of the month, their voices sharp with impatience as they demanded a table immediately despite the hour-long wait that everyone else had gracefully accepted. Denise had checked her seating chart 3 times, looking for any way to accommodate them, knowing that wealthy customers like these could either make a waitress's night with a generous tip or destroy it with a complaint to management. The only available table was number 7, tucked in the far corner near the kitchen entrance, a small two-person table that most customers overlooked, but that held more history than any other spot in the entire restaurant. She led them through the dining room with her practiced smile, pulling out Melissa's chair with the same grace she showed every customer, explaining that this was the only table available, but promising that the service would be exceptional. Richard Thornton had looked at the table like she had asked him to eat from a garbage can, his face twisting with disgust as he took in the location near the kitchen, the slightly worn wooden surface, the simple chairs that didn't match the elegant upholstered seating in the main dining area. "You expect us to sit here?" Melissa's voice was loud enough to turn heads at nearby tables, her perfectly manicured fingers gesturing at the corner like it was contaminated with something contagious. Denise kept her smile frozen in place, the way she had learned to do over years of serving people who looked at her uniform and saw someone beneath them rather than someone equal to them. She explained again that this was the only available table, that she would be happy to put them on the waiting list for a different spot, that she understood their disappointment but wanted to make their evening as pleasant as possible. Richard cut her off with a wave of his hand, telling her they would take the table, but that she should know this was completely unacceptable, that they had eaten at 5-star restaurants around the world and had never been treated with such disrespect. They sat down with heavy sighs and immediately began examining the table like health inspectors searching for violations, running their fingers along the surface, checking the silverware for spots, making faces at each other that spoke louder than their words. Throughout the meal, Denise served them with the same attention she gave all her customers, refilling their water glasses before they emptied, bringing their food promptly from the kitchen, checking on them regularly without being intrusive. Every interaction was met with coldness that bordered on cruelty, with Melissa refusing to make eye contact and Richard speaking to her in a tone usually reserved for misbehaving children. She noticed them taking photographs of the table, of the corner location, of the kitchen door that occasionally swung open to reveal the organized chaos of the cooking line, and she assumed they were documenting their dissatisfaction for a complaint she would have to answer for later. When she brought their check, Richard made a show of examining every charge, questioning the price of items clearly listed on the menu, suggesting that perhaps she had added things they hadn't ordered. Denise patiently explained each charge, provided a replacement receipt when he demanded one, and thanked them for dining at the Heritage with the same warmth she extended to everyone despite the ice in her veins. They left without a tip, which stung but didn't surprise her, and Denise had gone home that night thinking the worst was over, having no idea that the real storm was just beginning to gather strength on the horizon. The review appeared online the next morning, posted to every restaurant website and social media platform the Thorntons could find, written with the kind of venomous detail that suggested they had spent hours crafting each poisonous word. They described Denise by name, calling her the most racist waitress they had ever encountered, claiming she had deliberately seated them at the worst table in the restaurant while white customers who arrived after them received prime seating in the main dining room. The review included photographs that made the corner table look like a storage closet, described the food as arriving cold and the service as hostile, painted a picture of an evening so terrible that readers couldn't help but feel outraged on their behalf. Within hours, the review had been shared by accounts with thousands of followers, picked up by local news outlets hungry for controversy, transformed into a story about racism in the restaurant industry, with Denise as the villain everyone loved to hate. Comments poured in calling for her to be fired, calling for the Heritage to be boycotted, calling her names that made her physically sick when she read them late at night while her daughter slept peacefully in the next room. Mr. James had called her into his office that first afternoon, his kind face heavy with worrying as he showed her the review on his computer screen, his hand shaking slightly as he scrolled through the comments that accused his beloved restaurant of discrimination. He told her he believed her, that he knew the kind of person she was, that he had watched her treat every customer with dignity for 8 years, regardless of their race or their attitude. But the damage was already spreading like wildfire through dry grass, with cancellations pouring in and regular customers calling to ask if the accusations were true and reporters parking outside, waiting for someone to give them a quote. Denise had sat in that office and felt her world crumbling, felt the job she loved slipping through her fingers, felt the fear of how she would feed her daughter if the Heritage couldn't survive this storm. She had tried to explain about the seating chart, about the busy night, about how table 7 was the only option, but she could see in Mr. James's eyes that explanations wouldn't matter to people who had already decided she was guilty. The truth about table 7 was something that most people had forgotten, buried in decades of history that new generations never learned and old generations rarely discussed. Harold Jefferson had opened the Heritage in 1962 in the heart of a segregated Charleston, creating what he called a private club as a legal workaround that allowed him to serve whoever he wanted regardless of the color of their skin. On April 14, 1963, he had served the first integrated meal in the city's history at a small table in the corner, away from the windows where angry crowds might see, protected by the kitchen staff who stood ready to defend their guests if trouble came through the door. That table, Table 7, had hosted civil rights leaders and freedom riders, had been photographed for newspapers across the country, had become a symbol of quiet resistance in a time when such resistance could cost you everything. Harold Jefferson had kept that table simple and unchanged for 60 years, refusing to replace the original wooden surface or upgrade the basic chairs, preserving it as a monument to a moment when ordinary people did extraordinary things. Denise knew this history because Mr. James had told her about it on her first day of work, explaining that table 7 was the most important table in the restaurant even though it looked like the least impressive. He had given her the honor of serving that table because he trusted her to understand its significance, to treat the guests who sat there with the awareness that they were sitting in a sacred space. She seated people at table 7 carefully, choosing guests who seemed kind, who seemed like they would appreciate history even if they didn't know they were part of it, who seemed worthy of the legacy that Harold Jefferson had left behind. She had given the Thorntons that table not as an insult, but as a gift, seeing in their expensive clothes and confident manner people who might appreciate dining where history had been made. She had been wrong about them in ways that would haunt her for the rest of her life, wrong about the content of their character, wrong about the capacity of their hearts. The story might have ended there, with Denise losing her job and her reputation and her hope, except that Mrs. Dorothy Jefferson was still alive and still paying attention to what happened at her late husband's restaurant. At 91 years old, Dorothy moved slowly, but her mind remained sharp as a knife, and when her granddaughter showed her the viral review on a tablet computer, the old woman's eyes filled with a fire that her family hadn't seen in years. She remembered every person who had ever sat at table 7, remembered the fear and the hope and the courage of those early integrated meals, remembered her husband Harold staying up late to polish that simple wooden table with his own hands because he wanted to shine for the guests who risked everything just to eat together. Dorothy picked up her phone and called people she hadn't spoken to in years, civil rights veterans and historians and journalists who actually cared about truth, telling them that someone needed to set the record straight about Table 7. The second story broke for days after the first, but this time the truth was leading the way instead of chasing behind. Historians confirmed the significance of Table 7 with photographs and documents that made national news organizations finally pay attention to something other than outrage. Civil rights leaders issued statements calling Denise a keeper of sacred history, describing how she had honored the Thorntons by seating them at a table where brave men and women had changed the world. Local news ran segments showing the original photographs from 1963, interviewing Dorothy Jefferson in her living room as she held her husband's picture and explained why that corner table mattered more than any fancy spot in the main dining room. The narrative shifted like a river changing course, and suddenly the Thorntons were the villains, exposed as the kind of people who saw a simple wooden table and felt insulted instead of seeing the story could tell. Richard and Melissa Thornton tried to delete their review and their social media posts, but the internet never forgets, and the screenshots had already spread too far to be contained. Their own history began to emerge in the comments sections. Stories from former employees and service workers and neighbors who had their own experiences with the couple's cruelty and entitlement. Restaurants where they had dined before came forward with their own accounts of impossible demands and refused tips and threats of bad reviews, painting a picture of people who used their money as a weapon against anyone they considered beneath them. The backlash they had tried to create against Denise turned back on them like a wave returning to shore, and within a week they had become the faces of everything wrong with how some people treat service workers. The Heritage had its best month in 20 years as people traveled from across the state just to sit at table 7 and hear Denise tell its story. Mr. James gave her a raise and a new title, calling her the restaurant's official historian, paying her to share the legacy of Harold Jefferson with everyone who wanted to learn. Kayla got to meet Dorothy Jefferson at a special dinner held in the old woman's honor, sitting at table 7 with her mother and listening to stories about a time when sitting together for a meal was an act of revolution. Denise stopped having nightmares about the review, stopped checking social media for new attacks, stopped feeling like she had to apologize for a crime she had never committed. She had learned something about herself during those terrible days, learned that she was stronger than she knew, learned that truth has a way of finding the light even when lies try to bury it in darkness. On the anniversary of the first integrated meal, the Heritage held a celebration that brought together 3 generations of people whose families had been touched by Harold Jefferson's courage. Denise stood at the front of the room with Dorothy beside her in a wheelchair, looking out at faces of every color who had come together to honor a history that belonged to all of them. She thought about the Thorntons and felt something close to gratitude. because their cruelty had reminded everyone why Table 7 mattered, had brought new attention to a story that deserved to be told forever. She thought about her daughter growing up in a world where a little wooden table in a corner could represent both the worst and the best of humanity, where the same object could be seen as an insult or a throne depending on what you knew and who you chose to be. She thought about Harold Jefferson polishing that table 60 years ago, not knowing that his simple act of service would still be changing hearts long after he was gone. When she finally spoke, her voice steady and strong, she said the words that had been building in her heart since the day this all began. The table you sit at matters far less than the character you bring to it, and the only review that truly counts is the one written by your own conscience when you lay your head down at night.